Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at a crime case study, Pentonville Prison. First, a bit of background. Prison reformers like John Howard and Elizabeth Fry had campaigned for improved conditions in prisons. In the 19th century, time in prison had become the common sentence, making prison into the punishment rather than just the holding area for prisoners. I've done a previous video covering all this. There was an increased focus on the role of government. Prisons were more standardised with paid and professional staff. And changes in attitudes. People believed in rehabilitating prisoners through education, punishment through work, and religious reflection. And retribution. Prison was still meant to be unpleasant. These ideas are reflected in the new Pentonville Prison. So let's have a look at how it operated. Pentonville was built in 1842 as a prototype or model prison for a new type of prison philosophy, the separate system. 90 like it were eventually built or adapted from earlier prisons. As the name suggests, the idea was to isolate prisoners from one another as much as possible. Prisoners slept separately and, where possible, worked separately. Where this wasn't possible, measures were taken to make communication impossible or difficult. Have a look at this chapel scene, for example, from Pentonville. You'll notice that all the prisoners are seated individually with boards between them, so that even non-verbal communication would be difficult, but they do have a full view of the person reading the sermon. Prisoners were expected to reflect on their crimes and improve themselves. That was one of the key principles of the separate system, but it didn't always work out like that. Another reason for it was that prisoners were supposed to pray for forgiveness and guidance to live better lives. It also removed the bad influence of other prisoners. It was also supposed to be unpleasant. Prison was still meant to be a deterrent and a punishment. It showed the public that it was a serious punishment, serving as a form of retribution for crimes. The separate system influenced almost every part of the prison's design. As it happens, in a previous job, I used to work in a Victorian prison museum, Beaumaris Jail, and this has given me a bit of an insight as to how it works. Beaumaris was built some years before Pentonville, but was itself supposed to be something of a model prison. It was later adapted to reflect many of the changes made at Pentonville. So let's see how it worked. The prison had 5 separate wings, isolated from one another. These were connected by a central staff and administration building. Now, what I can tell you is when I used to work as an actor, actually pretending to be a warden within the prison, you could stand in this central section and look down each of the wings, so it actually reduced the number of staff that were needed. There were even sophisticated alarms where prisoners could twist a handle in the cell and a flag would pop out from the side, and then the prison guards could go down and see what was wrong. That also meant that they didn't actually have to shout out and communicate with other prisoners as well, and it would have been hard to hear them anyway. But that's not the only thing that isolated them. Each wing had dozens of individual cells which ensured separation. The prison could house 520 prisoners in total. But the cells weren't exactly luxurious. They were only 8 metres squared, so that's about 2 metres wide and 4 long. The window was also small and set high with iron bars for security. However, they did have some modern fittings, which would have been pretty unfamiliar even in many homes. This is a picture here of one of the cells actually in Beaumaris Jail where I used to work. The cells at Pentonville had been remodelled several times, which hadn't happened at Beaumaris, so this is a closer reflection to what the cells were like at Pentonville, even if the window's a little bit bigger. The cells were actually heated and had running water and a small basin, which drained into a toilet, flushing it. You can see it in the corner of the room here, although the toilet is slightly obscured by the hammock. This improved health and living conditions. However, it also meant that there was no need to leave because there was no shared toilet, there were no shared washing or eating facilities, so pretty much every part of a prisoner's existence could exist within this tiny locked room. They had little reason to ever leave their cell apart from occasional exercise and Bible study. The hammock at the side could be folded away to provide a little bit more space to work in. You can see there's a small desk as well. And we'll have a look at some of the jobs that prisoners did in a moment. Every aspect of a prisoner's life was governed by strict discipline. Walls were thick, which made communication between cells near impossible, and most work was done inside the cell. Even the treadmill and chapel had boards to prevent non-verbal communication, and masks during exercise did the same thing. Much less than being able to recognise a fellow prisoner, you'd never get to know them in the first place. Work was tedious and difficult. One common job was oakum picking. This involves prisoners picking apart old fibres from ship's ropes, which were often very gnarled and salt encrusted. I've actually had a go at it myself when I was in this previous job at Beaumaris Prison. At least this job had a bit of a point, because the reclaimed fibres were then used in shipbuilding to waterproof the gaps between the timbers. But I can tell you now, when you're not used to it and you haven't got calloused and rough fingers, it blisters the hands, and once they're blistered, the salt makes it sting. A really boring and unpleasant job. And then there's things like the tread wheel. At Pentonville, the tread wheel actually pumped water to the water tower, so it at least had a function, or at least I believe it did. That was certainly the case at Beaumaris, where I worked. But many tread wheels across the country were entirely pointless. Another one was the famous prison crank, which I've covered in a previous episode, which was another pointless form of labour. The prisoners knew this as well. They knew that what they were doing was pointless. It was just there to keep them busy and make them tired. Pentonville was designed to provide health and some modern comfort, as we've seen. But little was understood about the effects of long-term isolation on mental health at this time. Take this account by Oscar Wilde, who was a famous poet, confined at Pentonville for some time in 1898. Deprived of books, of all human conversation, isolated from every human and humanizing influence, condemned to eternal silence, treated like an unintelligent animal, the wretched man who is confined to an English prison can hardly escape becoming insane. You see, Wilde was not an unintelligent animal, and in truth, none of the prisoners at Pentonville were, and yet that's how they felt. Prisoners suffered from depression, hallucinations, and psychosis. Because the brain was so deprived of human contact, it would try and fill in the gaps by imagining things. People would see other people who weren't really there, hear voices, and other dangerous symptoms. Suicide rates were shockingly high. Prisons had been reformed, but some problems, as we see, persisted. So was Pentonville, and the other prisons like it, a change for the better? We're going to consider two contrasting contemporary views that both seem to think for different reasons they weren't. Contemporary view 1. No, prisons like Pentonville were still inhumane. Some reformers, including Elizabeth Fry, were concerned that the separate system was just a new type of inhumane treatment. Campaigners like Fry wanted a greater emphasis on rehabilitation, so that prisoners were better people and less likely to reoffend upon release. The separate system was intended to do this, but the enforced isolation was a key part of the government's focus on punishment and retribution. Fry felt compelled to write to the government. She wrote a letter to the Prison Surveyor General, Joshua Jebb, who oversaw and designed Pentonville Prison. Effectively, it was his idea. This is what she wrote. "These cells appear to me calculated to excite such an awful terror in the mind. I am certain that separate confinement produces an unhealthy state, both of mind and body, and that, therefore, everything should be done to counteract this influence. I consider light, air, and the power of seeing something beyond the mere monotonous walls of a cell highly important." But on the other hand, contemporary views too was that prisons should be harsher and not more humane. The 1865 Prisons Act made life even harder for prisoners. This law enforced a strict and uniform code of punishment across all prisons in the country. It explicitly focused on punishment rather than through reform through work or religion. Sir Edmund Duquesne, the Assistant Director of Prisoners, said, "Hard labour, hard fare, and hard board." Essentially, this translates as hard labour meaning hard, tedious work, 12 hours a day. Hard fare means a boring diet, the same every day. And hard board is more literal, wooden plank beds instead of the more comfortable hammocks that were previously installed at Pentonville. Both of these views had supporters across the country. Pentonville was an attempt to reform, but it had some unintended consequences too. So overall, was it a change for the better? Well, you can decide. Our final points then. Pentonville Prison was a prototype modern prison to introduce the separate system. Under the separate system, prisoners slept, ate, worked and washed separately. Even group exercise, work and worship was conducted in masks or behind boards to prevent communication. There were modern conveniences though, such as heating and running water. Isolation was supposed to encourage reflection, improvement and rehabilitation, as well as punishment. However, isolation led to mental health problems for inmates, and as time went on, the focus became increasingly about punishment. the 1865 Prisons Act enforced stricter regulations across prisons. This was summed up as hard labour, hard fare and hard board. That's the end of this rapid revision video. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please do drop the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more. If you've got something that you're desperate for me to cover, pop it in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. But for now, thanks very much and goodbye.